Hi, this is your buddy Quinn, and this is the introductory video to the next film in our Masterworks of International Cinema series called The Passion of Joan of Arc. The Passion of Joan of Arc is a French film from 1928, which puts it at the very end of the silent era. And over the course of this introduction, I'll be talking about some of the historical context, both for what's depicted in the film, as well as what was going on in France at the time. And then talking a little bit about the cinematography, the acting, and some key themes to watch out for as you watch this film. I'm going to start with a bit of a more detailed discussion of the historical context around what's depicted in the film. So this is a film that depicts events that happened in the medieval period in France. The events of this film actually take place in 1431. They're centered around the trial of Joan of Arc. And if you go back in time, the precipitating events that really lead up to this trial are a series of wars between France and England, collectively known as the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was an extended conflict between France and England over control of the French throne. So if you go back in time all the way to the Norman conquest of England, this is in the 11th century, you saw Frenchmen coming in and taking over the throne of England. And for a number of years after that, the kings of England were French speakers. This ultimately starts to change. And by the 14th century, we have English-speaking English kings. But the French royal families and the English royal families have become intertwined. And so when we have a crisis in the French royal household, where it's not entirely clear who should succeed the king because of a lack of a direct male heir, there becomes a dispute between England and France over who really should control the throne. And so if you fast forward to the latter part of the 100 Years' War, there have been a series of battles over control of the French throne. And there are two kings that are referenced in this film. The first is Henry V. Henry V was also a favorite subject of Shakespeare. Henry V invaded France with the intent to take the whole country. And his armies in the beginning of the 15th century were remarkably successful, so successful that he almost succeeds in 1415. And it forces the French king into a negotiation to recognize Henry V as the next king of France. He even marries the French king's daughter to seal the deal. Henry V dies shortly after this deal, though, and he's succeeded by his very young son, Henry VI, who ultimately claims the French throne when he comes of age. But this is contested by his French uncle, who is Charles VII. And so Charles VII plays a role in this film as Joan's ally, right? Essentially Joan's patron, who is fighting off the English claims to the French throne. So much of this film revolves around a narrative of French nationalism, where you have a rightful heir to the throne, Charles VII, and that is being contested on the ground militarily by Henry VI, who has come over from England to do so. Joan, interestingly, as a very young peasant girl, becomes the unlikely spiritual leader of the French armies under Charles, and ends up historically participating in some important battles that ultimately succeed in turning the tide of the 100 Years' War and will drive the English out of France in 1453, so about 20 years after the events depicted in this film. Joan of Arc, as a historical figure, is really quite a remarkable figure. She is, as I mentioned, a peasant girl. She's very young. She's a visionary as well. She has a lot of visions of angels, of important saints, and these visions instruct her to join the army of Charles VII and give her a specific mission to free France from English domination. She gains renown, particularly in a battle to relieve the city of Orleans, which is under siege, and quickly becomes a mascot, or perhaps maybe more strongly, a hero of the French armies, in part because of her incredible spiritual determination and courage. She was a part of this army of Charles VII and several other important victories, including a really important one to him, because this victory took back an important medieval French city called Rouen. This city was the historical coronation site for French kings. And so when Charles's armies were able to take this back, he was then coronated as the King of France. Crowned as the King of France. But in 1430, despite some of these successes that Joan participates in on the battlefield, she's captured. And she's captured by some French allies of the English. They're from Burgundy. And this becomes a major win for the English because they bring her to the capital of their holdings in northern France, in a town called Rouen. And they have this very popular French warrior state now under their control. She's put on trial there by a pro-English French bishop on a number of religious charges, primarily heresy for propagating false doctrines. But this serves England's political purposes during the war. Historically, 25 years later after this trial, once the English have been driven out by the armies of Charles VII, her trial ends up being reviewed by the Pope. The Pope rehabilitates her, declares her innocent of the charges, and she starts to become a really important figure in French nationalism. So Napoleon uses Joan of Arc during the Napoleonic Wars as a national symbol of France and French glory. And then later, she's even canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church. And this happens right after World War I in 1920. And she has become one of the 9 patron saints of France. A patron saint is a saint considered to have been appointed a special advocate with a divine mission on behalf of the French nation. She does go to trial, and that's the trial that's depicted in the film. She's taken to Rouen, to the castle there. This is where the English armies of France are able to keep her under control. The trial, as I mentioned, takes place in 1431. And what's quite interesting historically for this period of time is that very meticulous notes on this trial were taken. As a result, we have a really remarkable record of a young woman's life in medieval France. We have a record of the questions that she was asked in the trial. We have a record of her responses. And it becomes clear from these records that this trial was quite heavily manipulated by the English. Even though it was presided over by a French religious leader, a French bishop, the English had some pressure that they put on the trial so that this trial could be manipulated in a way that could get the outcome that they wanted. The trial is really quite interesting as well because it begins with an inquiry into her virtue, into her personality, and into her reputation. And so it's as much of a character trial as anything else. And we learn a lot from the historical record about Joan in the process. And the film that we're going to be talking about now represents a condensed but quite historically accurate version of this medieval trial on record, including the actual questions and responses that were recorded over the course of the trial. So if you're interested in medieval European history, this is a film that's worthy of your attention in its own right. But I want to turn now to why the film was made and what makes this film really so remarkable. The French have always had a core government interest in sponsoring the French arts and humanities. And the French Film Society believed that the film's director, Carl Theodor Dreyer, was a person of interest to them. He was Danish, though, so he wasn't even French, but they invited him as an important up-and-coming director to come to France and to make a film there. He was interested in making a historical film of an important French figure, which is something that the French Film Society was also interested in. and chose to do a film on Joan of Arc, in part because she was newly popular in France after she was made a saint in 1920. And I personally suspect that one of the reasons that the figure of Joan resonated so much at this time in France was that France had just recently, in the course of the Great War, what we now know as World War I, repelled another invader. In this case, it was Germany. Germany had been in northern France for a long period in World War I, and the parallels between Joan's efforts to repel the English in the Hundred Years' War, I think, resonated in particular during this time, as the French had just repelled the Germans from northern France. The director, Carl Theodor Dreyer, was from Denmark. He grew up in kind of a tough personal situation. He was an adopted child. His birth mother was actually a peasant girl from Sweden, much like Joan of Arc. He becomes a talented film director and makes 8 films in Scandinavia or in Germany prior to making The Passion of Joan of Arc in 1928. None of those had an enormous degree of success, but his talent starts to really shine through here. And that's what attracted the French to try to bring him in. This film is to become his major breakthrough, and he ends up making 5 more feature films after this one. They're primarily made in Scandinavia. And I think that there's something actually quite Scandinavian in style to this film. We've seen in Metropolis, for example, much of German expressionism, which includes elements of light, shadow, interesting angles. All of those things still exist in this film, but there's also a much more simple, trimmed down realism that's integrated into The Passion of Joan of Arc that we didn't see in Metropolis. Because Dreyer, the director, was Danish, many people actually in France felt very uncomfortable with him directing a biopic of a French national hero. But the quality of the production, I think, ultimately convinced many of them that he was a good choice. The existing print is a bit different than many people have seen before. There have been difficulties with preserving copies of the original film. The original negatives were actually burned in a movie studio fire. But fortuitously, in 1981, a copy, one of the copies of the original, was found at a Norwegian mental hospital, which led to a modern restoration of the film. If you watch the Criterion Collection version of the film, which probably many of you will, it also includes a really interesting, more modern musical score than you would have heard in France in the 1920s, which I personally find beautiful. It has a vocal score to it as well, which includes words from medieval women mystics, as well as words from the recorded trial and the historical record. And that soundtrack is called Voices of Light, which was composed by Richard Einhorn, especially for this film. This is a silent film, and for a discussion of silent films, you can also see my introduction of Metropolis, where we address that briefly. But this is quite a different film than Metropolis in a number of ways. And I think it really uses the medium of the silent film in more powerful and perhaps more effective ways than Metropolis does. Many of the elements of acting and cinematography, I think, would be difficult to replicate with the same effect if the film were dialogue-based and not silent. I want to now talk about some of the things that make this film particularly special and that are of interest to me. In terms of genre, this is a film in which plot is not a central element. This depicts a historical trial. Many people know the outcome of that trial already, so it's difficult to have a lot of suspense in the plot. I would consider this to be much more of a psychological drama. And as a result, I can imagine some people who watch the film thinking that this film is actually a little too slow for them, maybe too slow to hold their interest. If you're in that category, I do encourage you to hang on, make it through the first part of the film, because I think for a variety of reasons, it becomes much more interesting as the film progresses. It's also not a very long film. So whereas Metropolis was very long, this film is only about 80 minutes long in its current version. I also think one way you could think about genre here is that this is a film that is a study of the human face. Because we are so drawn into the various faces that we see in this film, we're essentially forced to grapple with the psychology of the trial that we probably wouldn't be forced to do otherwise. We really brought in to the film very, very personally, and it becomes quite easy to imagine that this is our personal interrogation and not just the interrogation of Joan. I think one of the things that makes this film special is certainly the cinematography. So it's probably beyond special. This is one of the great classics of early cinematography. And it's partly the result of some really interesting and innovative choices that Dreyer makes. Cinematography of this film will have impact on many, many films for a long time to come. One of the curious things about this that's hardly replicated at all in contemporary film is that there are no establishing shots. So an establishing shot is usually a shot that is panned out, where you see the background. Sometimes in contemporary film, you do it with drones, you see the city, you see the context, you see the castle, whatever that is, that helps the viewer to understand, okay, we are zooming into a smaller part of a bigger puzzle here. And we don't have that in this film. This film is made up almost exclusively of close-ups. And what that does is it disorients the viewer a little bit, because you don't really know quite what's going on. You don't know what the broader setting is. You're drawn just very directly into the emotional experience of individuals without understanding the broader context. And Dreyer makes some choices that I think pay off for him nicely. So he asks his actors and actresses not to wear any makeup. He uses a lot of bright lights, which cast shadows on all the nooks and crannies of an individual face, particularly when it comes to those who are accusing Joan in the trial. He uses really quite harsh light on them, so we get a lot of shadow on their face. He also uses a new film technology. It's called panchromatic film, that in 1928 hadn't been used in very many films before, but captures human skin tones much better than previous films had done. And that becomes really important in this film. He makes a choice also of using quite soft light when it comes to close-ups on Joan, in comparison to the harsh light of the accusers. And so the contrast between the two has a broader thematic message. Another really interesting thing about the cinematography here is the low angle shots. They are used particularly toward accusers. So the camera would be down and looking up at the accuser, and that way, you kind of see up their nose a little bit, and they look more imposing and bigger. For some of those shots, Dreyer had to drill holes in the floor and actually embed the camera in the floor. There are also some high angle shots that look down the top of people's heads. There are some shots that are really off center. And so as the film progresses, you go from close-ups with the character really centered in the shot to a wide variety of angles that often put the viewer in a place where they're seeing the action off center. There are also some pretty experimental shots. There are some upside down shots. There's a sequence where we see people essentially walking over the camera. And these were really important innovations at the time. Another reason that this film is special is the acting, and acting primarily by the actress who plays the role of Joan of Arc. Her name is Renee Jean, like Jeanne d'Arc or Joan of Arc, Renee Jean Falconetti. She was quite a well-known stage actor in France. She's much older than the 19-year-old Joan of Arc was, but she, I think, looks pretty young in this film. She only ended up ever doing 2 films, this being her last film. She also died reasonably young. But Dreyer found her acting on stage and believed that there was promise there, that she had real soul that came out in her acting that could shine through, that he could work with. And for many of her scenes, he really catered to her. So he often cleared the set of everyone else so that she could really deeply concentrate without any distractions, and there'd be silence on the set as she allowed herself to just pour her emotion into her performance. There are also some stories, I think some of these might not be entirely true, but there's a general sense that Dreyer would often really push her into situations where she felt physical pain, where she was so exhausted that that pain or that exhaustion would really shine through in her face and come out in the acting, representing the passion or the suffering of Joan. She was the only cast member that participated in the film's editing, and editing becomes really important here. And so she was considered to be the center and star of this, without a doubt. Most people really, really like Falconetti's performance in this film. It is very emotionally powerful. I find that it lingers with me for a long time. And it's not clear that acting with spoken lines could have ever been this powerful as it is in a silent film. There are not that many strengths that silent films have over spoken films, but this is one of them. And it's this ability to capture intense emotional acting without the distractions of the verbal dialogue. Let me suggest a few themes that I'd like you to focus on as you watch this film. One is power and its intersection with gender. So other than Joan, the only women in this film are extras, and they appear really only toward the end of the film. There's a clear power imbalance between the priests, the guards, and the magistrates, who are all men, and a very young 19-year-old Joan, and that power imbalance is something that the film reflects on. A major issue in the historical trial was the fact that Joan wore the clothes of a male soldier, and this does come up in the film as well. Her accusers find this really problematic, and I think it represents in many ways her challenge as an individual to the entirely male establishment, trying to break into that world and play a role that is not the role that they would traditionally give her. In the transcript of the trial, this doesn't come across in the film, but we do learn that keeping those clothes, those male soldier clothes, was so important to her because she feared that if she wore women's clothing, she would be assaulted by her guards. There are a lot of religious themes in this film, as you might expect. One of them is the corruption of the clerical establishment, which in the film comes across as being more interested in power and perhaps in politics than it is in sincere faith. There are some exceptions to that. Not everyone shows disrespect toward her, but many of her accusers certainly do. And there's really a tension throughout the film between the sacred and the profane, with the trappings of the sacred, the monks' robes and other things often being progressively profaned over the course of the trial. The film is quite deliberate in portraying the parallels between Joan's trial and Jesus's trial as depicted in the New Testament. We see her, for example, as being entrapped by manipulative priests, just like Jewish scholars sought to entrap Jesus. She's forced to dress with a crown and with a scepter. We see her tied to a stake. We see doves in the film, which represent in the New Testament the Holy Ghost. We see images of the cross, including an image that Joan sees coming through the shadows from a window pane. Even though Joan is the explicit heroine of this film, I also think that for the viewer, it's quite difficult to decide, do we admire Joan's intense faith? Or ultimately, do we find it naive in how black and white things are for her, right? Not just for us as the viewer of a black and white film. The film is called The Passion of Joan of Arc, and passion in this sense is usually referred to Jesus' suffering prior to the crucifixion or to depictions of that suffering in a passion play, for example. So in the title of the film, we're, I think, directly invited to see the parallels between Joan and Jesus here. In part of the film, there's a clear attempt by Joan's accusers to gaslight her or to make her think that she's crazy with her visions. And I think that plays into both the themes of the abuse of power that I talked about, but also faith in the absence of evidence. And so should Joan end up questioning her own faith, right, and her own reality, her own spiritual reality? And that becomes a psychological tension in the film. Toward the very end of the film, as we enter the town square, we also see some circus performers or jesters. I'd like you to notice them. I think that they can symbolize the circus this trial becomes. The public also emerges as a character in the second part of the film. They're depicted both as casual to this tragedy that's unfolding, kind of like public seem to be casual with Jesus in the New Testament, but they also progress in their realization that something bad is actually going down here, and that if this could happen to Joan, maybe that this could happen to anyone. And we start to see toward the end of the film both empathetic acts as people start to recognize Joan's virtue, but also anger at the authorities in control for one more act of abuse. You wouldn't guess it from watching the film, but the set for this film was extremely expensive because it tried to replicate physically the castle and the castle area in Rouen, where her trial was held. But ironically, we hardly get to see much of that expensive set because the director never uses those establishing shots that zoom out and really show it. We really get to see just a little bit of it at the end of the film as the riot begins to unfold. This was, in part because of the set, a really expensive film, but it did poorly in commercial terms. It was also a equal opportunity offender. So parts of it were considered offensive to the Catholic Church in the way that it portrays priests, and that mandated some cuts before it could be shown in theaters in France. The portrayal of the English was also quite offensive to England. And so England banned the film there. It was more successful in Scandinavia. But the verdict of history really has elevated the film. It did get Dreyer into some financial trouble. It made it very difficult for him to make further films in France, and that's why he started going back to Scandinavia to make his films. But this becomes really his masterpiece. And I hope that you'll take the time to give it a shot. It is a little bit slow at the beginning, but it picks up. And if you really have an appreciation for the acting and for some of the themes here, I think that this is really a clear-cut masterwork of international cinema. So enjoy the film.